In these videos, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the colonial period and the Articles of Confederation period and how they relate to what eventually makes its way into the Constitution. Hopefully you've read Chapter 2 already, and if you've studied this stuff before, this will be somewhat familiar to you. I just want to hit some of the most important points. First, about the colonial period. We're talking about the British colonies, of course. There were lots of other countries colonizing that part of the world during that period. We found Germans and French and Spanish and Portuguese and the Dutch. And of course, there were Native Americans already there. But we're focusing on the British colonies because they ended up having more successful long-term settlements than many of these other colonial powers. For instance, if you think about the Spanish experience on our coast, the Spanish experience was very, very top-down. They would send all the supplies necessary, lots of soldiers, build big walls. They'd send some settlers too. But all the money that was made by the colony was sent to the crown, and the crown provided all of their needs. This is quite different than the British experience. The British would sort of tap or give some authority to people that wanted to come over, say, okay, you're the one, you go on over, you can, colonize that piece of land. And then they were pretty much hands off, the British were. They didn't rule from the top down, but they ended up also just skimming off a little bit off the top. They were not extracting all of the money, and so the colonists kept most of it for themselves and began to get very used to governing themselves as well. Each of the colonies had a very different origin story. They had been started for different reasons. Jamestown, for instance, 1607 by business people. Massachusetts Bay by people looking to set up a religious community. And partly for these reasons, the colonies themselves, all 13 of them, had oftentimes very much closer ties to the crown than to each other. They were sort of, in many cases, kind of jealous of each other's economies. They didn't, there wasn't a sense of cooperation across colonial lines. They were kind of wanting to get attention from the crown to the exclusion of the colony next to them. And so we found, when we came to at the end of the colonial period, you found 13 different colonies very kind of separately organized. And certainly, so the crowns practiced what they called home rule. That's a phrase that's used by Benjamin Franklin. They governed themselves. When a bridge needed to be built, they didn't turn to the British government and say, hey, build this for us. No, they taxed themselves and decided where it was going to be built. They were pretty much in charge. Now this begins to change with the after effects of the French and Indian War. What had happened is that the French had allied themselves with several of the Indian tribes to the north and to the west of the colonies, the British colonies, and started attacking them. Now early on, Ben Franklin had proposed to some of the colonies to have a meeting where they would get together and form an alliance so that they could protect themselves. But the other colonies were not interested in cooperating with Franklin across colonial lines. In fact, what they did is they all individually applied to the British Crown for support. And is eventually what happened. The Crown sent over troops to defend the colonies. By the way, we call this the French and Indian War. In Europe, this was the 7 Years' War. So the French and the British were fighting on different other territory as well. It was a much larger event. So at any rate, they sent over troops, and because of that, and they were successful, because of that and other parts of the 7 Years' War, the British government was fairly deeply in debt. And so they were starting to look about for how to raise revenue. In 1765, Parliament passed what is the Stamp Act, or the first direct tax on the colonies. That they did not, the colonists did not like this, and they refused. They just kind of ignored it. The Parliament rescinded this tax about a year later because it was sort of awkward to have a tax on the books that no one would pay. But the problems of debt in the central government and in the British government didn't go away, and so in the next decade there were other taxes levied. We know in 1773, for instance, the Boston Tea Party, a tax that had been a part of all of this. And in 1774, the British Parliament passed what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. More taxes, but also soldiers would be stationed as well as administrators to actually collect the tax, which was very difficult in the period before this because they had been so hands-off. There were not enough administrators from Britain to actually enforce these taxes. Later that year, the colonists did get together and met for the first time in what we now call the First Colonial Congress, Continental Congress. And they planned that they were going to boycott and refuse the tax collection. So they all went home. The next year, the altercation becomes violent. Shots are fired at Lexington and Concord, and this paves the way for the Second Continental Congress to meet. And it's that body that authorizes Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence, which is then agreed to in 1776, and the start of the Revolutionary War in an official sense. Now, the other thing that happens during the Revolutionary period, of course, is that the colonists, what are now the state governments, agree to what is called the Articles of Confederation. This created a very weak national government between the colonies, with the state governments retaining almost all authority. As I'm sure most of you have read about, familiar, I'll just put this list here real quick. There were the Confederation, the central government didn't have any power to tax, so there was no money in the central treasury. They couldn't raise an army. They could actually ask the states for money, but the states, looking around at their neighboring states, realizing that they weren't contributing the money that they owed to the central government, decided not to as well. So most of the states were acting as free riders, deciding not to participate. There was also no central control over the currency, so all the states were printing their own money. And as a result, most of the people during this period were using still British money or gold and silver coin because the paper money was kind of out of control at the state level. The legislative body included just one vote per state, and this produced a lot of tensions between large states and small states. And the articles also provided for no executive power. If there was a law passed, it would have to be implemented separately in each of the states. This was producing all kinds of problems. So in 1786, James Madison and also George Washington called a convention in Annapolis in Maryland to try to revise the articles to give more control over commerce to the national government. I'll just give you one example of some of the problems that were emerging. George Washington owned a lot of property, and he owned a lot of property not only in Virginia where he lived, but also in Maryland. And his idea was to build a canal along the Potomac River, which runs through D.C. today, which could transport goods inland. He was thinking infrastructure, and now that there was no, British crown was gone, and it was an independent country, he was thinking of it that way, and so he wanted infrastructure to be able to link the states together. But what he found was that the states were all kind of quarreling about this. And they said, well, but who's going to pay for it? And if we pitch in, but that other state's going to benefit more than we are. And we don't want to just, participate in this way. So he couldn't get this going. And then also there were other kinds of things happening. For instance, New York was taxing goods coming in from Connecticut, and Connecticut was taxing goods from New Jersey, and they were basically trying to interfere with each other's and undermine each other's economies. They were not acting as a unified country, just as they were not during the colonial period. So some of these old habits continued, and in fact grew a little bit worse during this Article of Confederation period. So at any rate, they call this convention in Annapolis. Almost no one shows up. 5 states, I think something like 12 people, and Washington is livid about this and swears he will never participate in something like this again. He sort of washes his hands of it all and says, I'm going home to Mount Vernon. You guys figure it out. And then Shays' Rebellion happens. Now, Shays' Rebellion, many of you are familiar with. This was an uprising of some farmers, including Daniel Shays, who had fought in the Revolutionary War, and thought that when they went to fight, that number one, that they would be paid for their service, and number two, that their property wouldn't be taxed when they were gone. They came back to find that both of those were not quite true. They had been paid in scrip, which is sort of like an IOU, which was essentially worthless because everybody knew that the central government didn't have any money. But also his property had been taxed while he was gone and was in foreclosure. This was happening all over the place, so not only Daniel Shays, but lots of other people. And in fact, during this article's period, some of the new state governments raised taxes by 2 or 3 times, and many of those taxes were levied on the property of farmers. And so Daniel Shays and some others sort of took law into their own hands and marched around the countryside, burning down courthouses and seizing records and interfering with foreclosure proceedings. Now, there was a debate about what to do about Daniel Shays. They were eventually captured by some mercenaries who had been paid by some rich merchants. Daniel Shays himself escaped up to Canada. Some others were put on trial because there had been a couple people killed during this whole event. And some people said that Shays should clearly be put to death, or his accomplices should be put to death, because people shouldn't be allowed to take the law into their own hands. Thomas Jefferson, though, wrote a pretty famous letter during this period about this, and he said that he thought that a little rebellion every once in a while is a good thing for us. It draws our attention to the problems with our governing arrangements. So he thought that they should certainly be let off. They had been treated unjustly and had no recourse. At any rate, they are finally let off. But what's really important about Shays' Rebellion is that it leads the way to Philadelphia. Madison had been planning since the failure of the Annapolis Convention for another event, so was calling a meeting in Philadelphia. Washington had said, I will not participate in that meeting. Madison worked on him, and finally got him to agree. But Madison's idea really was to just get rid of the Articles of Confederation altogether. He had been thinking an awful lot about how to plan a new government, and he felt that one would have to start from scratch. He had done a lot of research on this, so he had been writing to people all over the world and asking for copies of ancient constitutions and thinking about how they govern themselves. And so, for instance, he wrote a book about this, but so for instance, he would say, well, this place in the 15th century, they had a legislature that was set up like this, and this is how they handled the courts, and this is how they handled foreign policy, and this is what happened to them. He knew a lot about history, and so he came to Philadelphia with a lot of these ideas in mind. Madison himself was about 5 foot tall, right about that, and his wife was about 5'10", and of course with his buddy George Washington standing about 6 foot tall, 6'4", they made a pretty interesting picture. But he was instrumental in bringing about the Philadelphia Convention.